Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gayo Muggle land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, he's a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. My guest today is a newly inducted president of the Uniting Church in Australia. So people might notice that my usual, combative gotcha self will be absent in this interview. Reverend Sharon Hollis. Reverend Sharon, welcome along.
Thanks for having me, Liam. I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Woiwurrung language, and I acknowledge them today.
So thank you for joining us today. So obviously you only just recently been inducted into the Uniting Church as president. You've been part of the Uniting Church much longer. I guess one of the questions I have is, how does someone become president of the Uniting Church in Australia? Now I'm less interested here in the actual formal procedure, but as in, that's not something that most folks out there know exists, aspire to, think is something that's a path, a thing. So what, I guess, in your life drew you to this point that you now have responded to this call?
Well, I mean, I don't think it was ever something I aspired to either. I was going to say you get elected, like that's the cute answer. I guess. So I've been ordained nearly 30 years. So I set out on ordained ministry fairly young, particularly when I was ordained. So it's been one of the great joys actually over the last 25 years to watch younger people enter ministry. When I went to college, there were like 3 people in their 20s training. Right. And that was considered a boom of young people. So I do think part of it is just not longevity and just I sat around and waited for my turn, but just that fact that I've had 20 years in kind of ministry leadership roles, I think probably at one level prepares one for a role like this. I had 2 congregations and then I moved into a synod role. So I undertook, I was for nearly a decade doing continuing education for clergy in the Victas Synod, and it is a job I would go back to at the drop of a hat. I loved it. It was I love adult education. I really loved working with ministers and helping them kind of grow and develop their capacity and capability for ministry. So I guess a role like that puts you in touch with a diverse number of people in your church. So then I was elected moderator, and I think that was partly, like I do think part of this is you have to be sort of known. So like it shouldn't be the case, but I do think cynically profile helps in as much as people know you, they trust you, they can see something in you. These roles still do carry both symbolic importance, but also particularly I think, moderator, like, at the end of the day, you get to stand ministers aside if they behave badly, and you meet with people who've been wronged by the church, and as well as in good moments and celebratory moments. So people have to have some confidence in you that you can do the work. So I think a role where you get to meet a lot of people does help a lot of people develop some confidence in you. In my role, when I was in the continuing education role, I did a master's. Well, nearly did. I didn't quite finish it. Life took over, but I've got 5/8 of a master's of educational leadership. So I suppose for a while I've been thinking about the nature of leadership. And educational leadership's interesting because it's mostly I did it at Australian Catholic University, where there were a lot of teachers, and particularly people wanting to be heads of RE. Which is paid the same as a deputy principal in Catholic system. So it's quite an attractive role. If you're a person of faith, it's a really attractive role.
There you go. Squirrel that away, I guess.
Indeed. I'm not a teacher, so that pathway's not for me. I don't have a Bachelor of Education or anything. So I think because education is like it's a business at one level, but it's also at another level, the for-purpose or not-for-profit sector. Thinking about leadership in that space is actually quite helpful as a church leader, because you're engaging with material that's not written explicitly for you, but which shares some of the same kinds of philosophy and concerns as the church. So, I mean, I'm not saying we can't learn things from literature written around leadership and business, but I think there's a lot more translation to do. And I quite like that dynamic of having to do some translation, because it pushes you to think, well, okay, you know, to what extent am I being enculturated by something that's foreign to the church, foreign to the way of God? To what extent is there wisdom? Can I see the movement of the Holy Spirit in this? So I guess partly I'd also been thinking about leadership. So, and as someone said to me, being a moderator looks good on a president's CV. I presume I did an okay job as moderator, and people came to me, and I mean, I love big picture thinking. I love the kind of the sweep of work that moderator and president gives, which I guess means I've probably also developed some gifts in that space. So I allowed my name to go forward, and you make a video and the assembly votes, and there you go.
There you go. There you go. Oh, thank you for that. It's interesting. So as you say, you've been ordained 20 years. You've been in a variety of roles, including, as you say, that moderator role where, and I guess continuing education too, where you get to see a broad swath of the church, right? You're not just kind of you and the congregation and occasional trips to presbytery and stuff like that. And I think, from my experience, sometimes it's kind of like ministers who've been in it a while kind of tend to go two ways. There's the ones who go, I want as little to do with the broader machinations of this church as possible, right? I love it. It's all good, but that's just absolutely not for me. I've got this that I'm working on. And others who kind of, are drawn to it and move further in. But then I'm sure also that movement further in, as you say, you see both you stare at people's joys and concerns. You also see maybe the breadth of the hurt, the breadth of the problems, just how deep down, some of the cultural issues we're still trying to work through, and failings of the past that we've inherited go, which I'm sure stops a lot of people from going, I want to take another step, either toward moderator or president. So I guess one question I'm thinking about is what was it for you that kind of kept you going? No, I'll stay at this level, or this kind of broader church level, and I'll continue to wade deeper into that, rather than going, ooh, that's you guys, someone else, and I'll there's other good work to be done, and I'll go do that elsewhere. Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard to say, except that I somehow find that attractive. So I suppose I'm a big picture person. As people will discover, as across Australia, as they get to know his president, detail's not always my thing. So there is something for me interesting about actually seeing the sort of bigness of the problem. That I or the joy that I kind of like. I think as a in systems kind of way. So I kind of enjoy that sense of, actually there's some patterns to some of this. There's some, when you're in the middle of it, it can feel like your situation is totally unique, and every situation does have its unique qualities. But I actually quite like that. That sense of what's the pattern here? Are there things we can see so that if we could address the pattern or the system, actually we could help a lot of people who think they're stuck in their own unique issue, or at least provide some structure or some scaffolding for them to address the unique presentation of the kinds of structural issues that we're dealing with. So I actually don't know why my mind is wired that way, but that's how I like that. When I was at uni, I studied human geography, and I really loved things like demographics and looking at the geographic pattern of things, and why is it all the psychologists are in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, where their fee can be met with less stress than in the West, and like looking at the fact that the kinds of struggles that individuals experience actually can be mapped, it can be seen and studied and analysed. like, yeah, even at uni that interested me. So yeah, I can't explain why my brain was why it kind of had that initial interest, but I suppose you know, what you feed grows in that sense, and I've always kind of been interested in that. I've fed that part of myself, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So thinking about that, thinking about if you had a map up on the wall in front of you now, and you're starting to think of some of these issues that you're seeing mapped out, like for the church, some of the ones that you think are at play in a lot of the individual problems that we're facing. I guess what are some of those like ones that you're maybe seeing or you're thinking are most prominent in, I guess, the landscape of the UCA today?
I mean, I think one of the significant issues is that the resources aren't necessarily where the ministry needs are. So I think we've got to really face that issue, that we've got, I think, amazing ministry opportunities. We've got amazingly talented and gifted ministers and congregations and people, and emerging communities that don't fit any of our current contemporary categories. But sometimes, and some of that can be done with no resourcing. Like, I do think we can overemphasize the need for resourcing, but I do think nonetheless, I think we have one of the issues we've really got to tackle is how do we put the particularly the physical and financial resources where we think the ministry needs most are. How do we, I mean, at one level, particularly ordained ministry or pastoral ministry is a user-pay system.
Yep.
And I think in no way is that a justifiable way to manage how we resource ministry effectively, because I don't think just because a certain group of people can pay, and that's increasingly not paying out of their own purse anymore. So, gone are the days where, I mean, when I started in ministry, your aim was to kind of meet your basic needs through the plate, like direct giving from members. I think that's increasingly not how congregations are meeting their needs. They're meeting them by leveraging the assets they've got to create income, and that means that that those places with the most privilege are entrenching their privilege because we've still got a user-pay system of ministry. And I think that is a really pressing question. So, why is it congregations that have a lot of promise, or faith communities that have a lot of promise, are struggling to, and I'm not saying they have to have ministry in the kind of traditional, one congregation, one minister scenario, but I think we're kidding ourselves to say all new expressions of ministry can be done for nothing.
Yeah.
Because established ministry is not done that way, and I don't see why we, like, there is something about, startups that kind of doing it on the seat of your pants can be helpful, but not always. So, so I think that is one of the issues we face. How do we develop a more a kind of needs-based approach to funding the ministry of the church, broadly understood, rather than a kind of who's got capacity to pay. And I've been thinking about that ever since mobile phone towers were a thing back in the day, when getting a mobile phone tower was a solution to your dwindling giving. And it meant congregations were entering into these contracts with mobile phone companies back in the sort of mid-90s, and you could just see it meant they had a security that had nothing to do with whether they needed that money or not. And I remember one community that decided not to go that way because the reaction from their neighbours was so strong, back when we also thought mobile phone towers were going to also get brain tumours. But, you know, like they actually listened to their neighbours and didn't go down that path. And you think, well, actually, is that a model of ministry that should be encouraged, where you actually pay attention to the people that don't belong to you, but who are your neighbours? You know, that struck me as actually a ministry disposition we'd want to encourage.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, I mean, I think that's one of the kind of pressing practical issues. I think, I mean, you know, anybody that's read anything coming out of Assembly will know that one of the things that really concerns us, and I am kind of committed to, is the fact that we have a structure of governance that no longer, like, we're over governed. And I don't mean that in a way that says I don't want people to hear me say, well, let's just involve less people. But I think we need to find ways that are lighter and sleeker and easier to navigate, that kind of look more like what contemporary, what our capacity is. So, you know, one of the great joys of the Uniting Church is, like, I mean, at one level we are hierarchical, as people point out to me, you know, like when you become moderator, you get a stole, it's got a silver panel on it. When you become president, you get a scarf and it's got a gold panel on it. Like, you know, especially the Olympics year, there's a certain hierarchy in that.
Yes.
And, you know, I mean, I sense the deep respect many people have for the role that I now occupy. But I think we are still, relatively speaking, a church that likes to engage a breadth of its membership in a range of decision-making processes, and I don't want that to end. I think that actually equips us well for the kinds of decisions that have to be made. There's a certain kind of locating the decision as close to those affected as possible that comes from that. But having said that, we are massively over-governed. You know, the people that set the governance structures and the councils of the church out just couldn't, I don't think they could even have imagined that the church would be the size and shape and spread that it is. And I just think we can hold on to principles of interconciliar governance, of a kind of consensus approach to decision making, while also making it easier to navigate and tying less people up. Governance is crucial, and I think if our governance doesn't reflect who we want to be, that's a problem. But it shouldn't become who we are either. So, like, there's a whole lot of ministry and mission to get on with that people are struggling to get on with, because we're governance heavy, we're committee heavy, we're structure heavy, and you know, as I say, part of the deep attraction of the Uniting Church for me is that governance, the way we go about decision making, and being, but not at the expense of trying to be who we are meant to be in the communities we live in and work in and engage in mission in. So I think we have to resolve that too.
I think that's really really important. I think, you know, you're saying how, like, you know, those who are, you know, coming up with these systems and structures couldn't foresee the size and the shape, but also just the societal changes of, you know, people are now working a lot longer. You know, back maybe for a lot of people there in the mid 70s, it's like most people kind of finishing work at 5, home before 6, didn't have work that carried over to the weekend, often lived closer to extended family and support network. So if you needed someone to come and mind a kid while you went to an evening meeting, like, easier. Also, that you had more people retiring early mid 50s. So you had this huge swap of people with buckets of time, with still high kind of levels of you know, capacity, energy to go and do stuff. You know, that you know, supported, you know, and just more people total. But all those kind of factors together meant you could have, quite a large system in play, because it was not too much an arduous thing to expect someone to be at 1 or 2 meetings across a week or what have you. So very different now.
And I mean, nobody was sitting in church listening to your sermon, keeping an eye on the, you know, emails coming in from work, wondering what disaster was coming their way.
Absolutely. No, totally right. Well, you know, and I was just going to say, I
went on placement in the early 90s, and one person had like a size of a brick mobile phone, and it was the local funeral director / real estate agent.
Okay.
Who did take a phone call one Sunday. It was extraordinary. My supervisor was announcing the death of a member and saying, I'm not quite sure when the funeral's going to be. The phone went off, and about 3 minutes later he says, oh, I can tell you when the funeral's going to be. And then another 5 minutes later the phone went off again, and some witch in the congregation said, oh, that's the family ringing to sell the house.
Yeah, tell you what, it's a decent like integrative business model there to pull those two together.
But like one person had a phone that would interrupt them from their focus on a Sunday morning. Everybody else was a captive audience. Like nobody's nobody anymore.
No. Yeah. So I think that's it. Like, I mean, and the what people have often remarked about how rapid things have changed technologically, say from no cell phones to, cell phones that could just do calls and text to now the world in your pocket, to find out anything and communicate in all different ways. Like that has, and to this technology, right? Like, has been so fast that they often talk about how legislation trails technological development and so too like church polity and church practice and the way we think about all these kind of things does so as well.
Yeah, and at one level it probably should, because if we kept changing church governance every time,
right,
if we changed for the call only cell phone, we'd still be behind. So there's a sort of sense that you have to wait until there's a pressure on you. But I think that's the thing, the pressure's like it's now so obvious we have to kind of get on with it.
We've been talking a little about the past of the church and the change and the times now. It's so just this year the Uniting Church whatever it's called, Historical Society group did a conference on growing up uniting. And I was thinking about how, with your election and with the election of Reverend Carissa Sully into president-elect, and even maybe some extent with Dr. Deirdre Palmer before you, but really with you and Carissa, we're getting into presidents now who've truly only known the Uniting Church. I mean, Carissa was born after Union.
Yeah.
But who've only served as Uniting Church members, who've only known this form of the church, not the lowercase Uniting churches beforehand. How do you feel that, I guess, both personally, but also on a broader scale, is going to shape, and that's obviously going to trickle down into all these other, ministers like myself, other people in presbytery and moderator and synod roles. We're kind of getting into that now where that's going to be much more the norm of different positions. How are you feeling like that's going to shift, change, add questions that maybe haven't been than previously?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing, because one of the things that people who were around at the founding of the Uniting Church and people who knew them, and I feel the measure of, I get the excitement, but I wasn't part of it. I was born before the Uniting Church, but I was 9 when it came into being, and we'd moved to a new suburb in Melbourne, and so Union was coming, and so they didn't build, it was technically a Methodist church, but it was basically a Union church.
Right.
It was built with the expectation it would be the Uniting Church. So yeah, I literally have almost no sense of what that means. Other than kind of some memories from my mother and grandmother. So, but one of the things they talk about is that they were founding a new denomination at one level, but that kind of fervour for Union was such that they really saw us as non-denominational, or not really a denomination somehow, that I think they hoped there'd be more unions and there'd be I don't know, but I do think we've now come to realise we are a denomination, we're an institution, and I at one level we need to keep that movement spirit, but at another level, particularly when you exercise leadership, you come to realise that there's stuff you've got to take responsibility for, and that requires structure and a certain level of being an institution. And I think trying to be a healthy structure is really wise. So I was really intrigued watching the videos for the New South Wales ACT Synod, where one of the questions they asked was what's unique about the Uniting Church. And I think there's been a real hesitancy to ask that question up until now, because there was this sense that actually really we were trying to move ourselves into something bigger, to not be unique, but to be open to that we somehow thought being unique, stating our uniqueness meant further union would be harder, that we were becoming more like just another denomination. So I do think part of when this is all you've known is you have to accept that we actually, like, whether the founders meant it or not, we have become a denomination. Like there's just no getting away from that, you know. And for whatever reason, to do with the zeitgeist of the time, I think further institutional union is off the table for the foreseeable future. Partly because of decisions we've made, partly because I think culturally that's just not where people are at anymore. You know, we're happy to try and, you know, I think at a local level, ecumenism still has patches of being very active and people engage in it when it's sort of mutually beneficial primarily. But so I do think that's one thing, that actually we just accept almost that this is a denomination, that we're going to get on with it, we're going to be who we are, you know, not uncritically, but we're in the landscape of the Christian church in Australia as the Uniting Church in Australia. And that what's becoming our tradition actually is no longer the constitutive traditions, and how we, you know, how we were a bit of this and a bit of that, and we tried to bring the best of all of them and make something new. Like, and I do think, you know, that thing that says it wasn't ecclesiastical carpentry's right, that they were really searching for something brand new, and that's just no longer the case anymore. It's not brand new. It's 44 years old. It is a denomination. It's got an institutional footprint that's actually quite big in Australia. Like when you take into account, you know, all of the uniting care agencies, you know, Uniting World, Frontier Services, plus our congregational footprint. It's, you know, it's got a fair presence, not big in terms of numbers, and, you know, all the constituent problems about our size and whether we're declining or growing or whatnot. But I do think that coming, like, I literally feel Uniting Church. And so it's just a given in a way, I think. So I'm not wondering, you know, I think it's about what does that mean, growing into that, accepting that, kind of thinking about what is the charism of the Uniting Church, rather than as a fixed thing, rather than as a kind of, we might be out of business in a couple of years if someone else wants to join with us thing. And I think that is a genuinely new thing. And I think in that sense, you know, like the base of union continues to be, for me, really important and guiding in what that means. But I do think, as opposed to the founding, basically fathers, you know, that we live with just the reality of it. We are the Uniting Church. This is who we are. This is who we want to be. This is who we have been. You know, we have to accept, like, some of the institutional legacy that we're dealing with is from our predecessor churches. We just have to accept that we carry that with us for good and for ill. But I think what's happening is an emerging Uniting Church identity, and I think we just accept that, you know, and the things that we don't do well, but that we're trying to do, you know, that we have entered into covenant, we have the preamble, we are a multicultural church. Those are all beginning points, not end points. Like, I think they're pointing to who we want to be, but I think when you've grown up uniting, that's maybe one of the things you just accept. This is, as a denomination, where our commitments are to kind of, you know, exploring the edges and asking about inclusion and what's the next step in that journey. So I don't know, I just, I don't have any nostalgia I don't really have a nostalgia for being. I probably would have been Methodist. I think, like, my mother and grandmother are Methodist, so there's a bit of Presbyterian in our family as well. But yeah. I mean, I'm interested in it, like, as part of the theological tradition. So, I'm interested in what Methodists and Presbyterians around the world are saying theologically, but I don't have a nostalgia for being a Methodist in Australia. And I think probably we are probably the first leaders of the church who are at that point of, our nostalgia is for 15 years ago. 20 years ago, not for, like, even the moment of union, I have absolutely no memory or recollection. So I think it was I just, like, the work that went into that is extraordinary. And to be honoured always. And as I say, for me, the base of union continues to be a key, so, like, absolutely foundational to trying to shape my own leadership, my own thinking about the life of the uniting church. But I'm not even nostalgic for that moment.
And I think what you're saying there about, like, that actually claiming that identity and going, we can make decisions that kind of that bolster it, right? That lean into it, or that bring aspirational identity, bring polity into line with aspirational identity, right? Like that, we can lean into that one in that sense of, and maybe that forecloses the possibility of church X, Y, or Z joining. But also it means it's honest about if a church did want to enter into union and that conversation started up again, we've actually established some things about who we are, what we value. But I think it's also important for, I think, as you say, for so many of the folks who are just part of the uniting church now, who are younger, who don't have that memory, like, who I know in kind of my generation and younger, it is just like, no, this is the church we want to be a part of. Like, we want to be a part of this for various reasons, because it's just so not a given to be a part of any church now. So if you've chosen to be a part of the uniting church, if you're a young person who's chosen to be part of the uniting church, you've done so for pretty specific reasons. And so it's kind of honoring of that to say, yes, let's actually carve that out, which I think also then maybe presses on to another thing that is maybe, I think, sometimes a bit of a generational gap of, there's sometimes this idea of, like, there's a reality of this, right? The uniting church is a broad church, right? You can huge swaths of very conservative to very progressive, and those obviously are very trite labels, but you get what I'm saying. This huge swath of theological and political and aesthetic approaches, and sometimes that's led to a kind of, the uniting church sort of believes a bunch of things and sort of doesn't, but it seems almost now there's a bit more of at least a desire from some to go, let's actually claim an identity, and let's claim some very, firm beliefs on things. And, I'm sure, and past documents have done that too, Multicultural Church and the preamble, but like, the decision on decision on sovereignty, decision on marriage, a host of those do seem to be a kind of push into, we want to have at least a little more of, we can point to these things, even with acknowledging the reality of there's other uniting churches that won't, but we can point to these things as saying something about this church and movement that we have chosen to be a part of, and really try to have that as something that has a distinct kind of more firm identity rather than a constant openness.
Yeah, and I think for me, like, one of the interesting things about union is, like, there's a sort of almost like it's the beginning of decolonizing almost in union. Like, the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, they came to us, and we are part of that. Like, as white Christians, we it's part of our narrative we have to own, absolutely. But denominations are a gift of the colony. Like, they reflect the fractures of Europe. As if that's the kind of fixed narrative about Christian faith. And so, like, when you actually willingly enter into a conversation to try and bridge some of those gaps, those schisms of the old country, in a sense, in a new country, like, I don't think they thought that this is where it would end up. But it's actually like the very act of union is an invitation to say, what are the divisions we have inherited really culturally that no longer serve us, that no longer serve the gospel? And I think that's what they were doing at union. So that, you know, the founders recognized that the call of unity in the gospel was not served by these denominations that were inherited from another place and another time and from different conflicts that no longer had resonance and relevance, you know, in 1950s and 60s Australia. And that's part of our DNA, that story that says what in our own life is not serving the gospel. And like in all those decisions, faultingly and fleetingly, we're asking, I think, those questions. What in our own life is no longer serving the gospel? So, you know, not to be in covenant with Indigenous people does not in any way serve the gospel. And that is the beginning of overcoming, you know, the sin of colonisation, the sin of dispossession, the sin of unrecognised sovereignty. And it's a tiny step, and like we have so far to go still. And, you know, in all the conversation about structure and governance, for me, that's got to be a key question. What do Indigenous Christians think is the best place for them in the Uniting Church? Not what do I think, not what do, you know, other white people in the church think. What do Indigenous people think? And even be open to that question from beyond the Uniting Church. You know, what do other Indigenous Christians think Congress should be for the Uniting Church, and what do they want structurally to make that that possible? But we have to keep asking that question, you know, like how do we really honestly constantly critique the impact of the sin of colonisation on our church, and what in our life is preventing us from hearing the gospel on this? So, and how do we keep the kind of the impulse of union to keep asking that question, keep doing the really critical self-examination? Because if I want to be nostalgic for anything about union, and as I say, I really don't remember it, but I did have parishioners who kept telling me about the kind of really deep study they did around union, like all the Bible studies and all the prayer and all the reflection and the reading of the basics, like regularly, you know, as they voted on it. That's the kind of impulse I'd like us to carry. If we're going to carry, you know, that's what I hope is still in our DNA, that really willingness to ask those deep questions, to do that deep thinking about what is getting in the way of the, you know, the life of the gospel in our own life as much as in the life of our community. Because I think if we ask it for ourselves, that will flow into the work we do with our neighbours. But if we won't ask it of ourselves, we just carry that with us into the neighbourhood and kind of keep imposing it on people. You know, and there's nothing more tragic than having to, you know, than seeing the deep impact of institutional abuse on people, and the damage that does to individuals and to families and to communities. So that's why I think we owe it to us. We owe it not just to ourselves, but to everybody we're in ministry, and to be regularly self-reflective about what in our own life is not of the gospel. Like personally, my congregation, you know, for me now in the life of the assembly, what's getting in the way of the fullness of life that the gospel promises? How do I, you know, really be honest about that?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. So I guess we're kind of coming toward a close. So I guess as you think of forward, you've got several years of the role of president ahead of you. But, you know, we know from presidents, you know, are always concerned with legacy, always about establishing something that they'll be known for and that we mark their years. And so I guess, even though posed flippantly, I guess, but do you have a thing of that as you've stepped into this, that you kind of, I guess, hope in some way your term, your service in this role might be known for, if not in the moment, perhaps? perhaps afterwards.
I have to get you one day, Liam, to tell me what the legacy of every president is, so I can work out what mine should be. Funny role, because like it's literally the second. So like, you know, day 2 of the role, there's my successor.
Yeah.
Like, not hanging around. There's absolutely zero doubt that I'm hanging around. So, you know, like it's an interesting question about legacy, because what can you do in 3 years to you know, the behemoth that isn't in any institution? I guess what I hope, so the theme you know, you get to choose a theme, which is a odd thing in and of itself, but the theme I chose for the assembly is dwelling in love. And it's always tricky when you use love in a theme, because it can sound so kind of hallmarky, flippant, but I really do hope the legacy, if I have a legacy, or what I'm hoping my leadership brings, is a capacity to be in honest conversation with each other about the very real challenges that we are facing. So, you know, that's for me what the dwelling in love kind of means, that we know we can be with each other in hard places because God dwells with us. God is with us. Like, you know, the enfleshment of God really changes the world, and it means we can make and live through hard things because God journeys with us. But I think if we think that, and if we know that, and if we believe that that is a life-changing moment, then it means we need to be regularly being in hard spaces with each other in ways that are as loving as possible, but not just kind of in a way that says, you know, let's all be nice to each other and avoid the hard issues, but actually says, because we really, because I value what the love of God has brought to my own life, and I want that value in the world. I want the reign of God to be more manifest in the world. We will have the hard conversations. We will stay with each other in love and hear things we don't want to hear, and do the work we don't want to do at first blush because it's hard and painful, and it forces us to face, you know, the shadow side of ourselves. But I think I feel like we're at a point in the life of the United Church where if we don't have those conversations soon, there won't be any point having them, because we'll have kind of just let a moment slip by and let what could be really the possibilities of the Uniting Church kind of could be buried under the weight of, you know. I'm in my early 50s, and I watch my girls, and I realize there are things about my life I neglected in my 20s and 30s, and it comes home to bite you in middle age. And quite frankly, we're at that point in the church where we've got to, you know, we've got to do the tough love stuff of, you know, facing what's come back to bite us a bit.
Yes.
And, you know, like that is hard. It does mean the personal trainer yells at you. Not that I have a lot of experience of that, I hasten to add, but I watch it and I avoid it. You see, I think, oh God, I don't want to be yelled.
No, I'm with you there. Oh, that's great.
And I don't want yelling in the church, but we do need to have those really tough conversations. And I guess, I suppose perhaps why I was elected was I'm up for those conversations. Like, I know at the other end of them, there's life.
Yeah.
It won't feel like it in the moment, but there is life at the other end of them if we stay with each other and have them. And particularly if we listen to voices that we've marginalised in the past. Yeah. Like for me, that's the key too, that it's about whose voice are we going to listen to in these tough conversations. And it can't just be the same old voices. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. We always end the show in plugs. Anything you want to plug right now? Anything you want to promote, draw people's attention to?
Well, the comms team at Assembly would say national update, weekly news about the Uniting Church.
There you go.
Get on the email list. But also, particularly for people in the Uniting Church, just Act 2 stuff will be coming in the next kind of this second half of this year. And I really want to encourage people to engage in the conversation. So, yeah. And I'm always happy to plug your show, Liam. I think I know you're approaching your 100th episode. You've been doing it 4 years. It's pretty remarkable that you've you've managed this with ministry and kids and stuff, and I think it is a huge gift, I mean, to the Uniting Church, but more broadly, just to the church and to the intellectual life of Australia. You know, like, congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
Keep at it. That's my plug. Keep at it.
All right. Oh, I have to. You're my boss now. So,
Yeah,
no,
luckily I'm not.
Yeah. Yes, just to be. But no, I appreciate that. That's very generous of you, and you've always been very encouraging to me. So I appreciate that a lot, and I'll be praying for you through your term, and hopefully we'll have you back on for another conversation sometime. But yes, all the best going forward.
You can tell me if I've got any legacy or not.
Yeah, exactly. We'll bring on a panel,
Yeah,
and we can all reflect Sharon's legacy. All right, so look for that episode in about 3.5 years, folks. So that's my motivation to keep going, so I can deliver on that. Oh, thank you, Sharon, for joining us. Thank you, folks, for listening. We'll see you all next week.